Well, we all live with a sense of uncleanness. We all know what it's like to have that feeling, that knowledge that something is fundamentally wrong inside of us. You see, the human conscience is imprinted upon our souls, and so when we reflect on maybe the harsh words we spoke to our kids, the unholy thoughts we had, or perhaps the way we told a white lie to our employer, whatever it may be, we know what it's like to live with that sense of guilt, that sense of shame. When we think about the holiness of God, we know what it's like to have a grasp of the chasm that exists between us and Him. Deep sadness over sin is something that all of us experience and feel at times, and yet we also live in a culture where we're bombarded with this narrative that we shouldn't feel guilty, that we shouldn't feel shame, and yet people continue to live with a deep sense of sadness, of guilt, a heavy burden. In fact, in Romans chapter 2, the Apostle Paul even mentions the fact that people who haven't heard the gospel still feel the conviction of sin. Their thoughts condemn them. And while the conscience is powerful enough to make us feel guilty, it's not powerful enough to relieve us of that guilt. If you're familiar with Shakespeare, one of his, I guess, darker stories is about a Scottish general, Macbeth, and he is dead set on becoming the king, and so that drives him to commit murder. He kills the king. He wants to take the throne. His wife convinces him that it'll be okay, and a little water will cleanse them of the ways in which they've conspired and carried out these murders. It becomes a lot more complicated than that, though. And it leads to more bloodshed, and even the wife, Lady Macbeth, she comes to a point where she is overcome with this sense of guilt, this uncleanness she experiences of her sin. She can't sleep. And she begins to imagine at night that there's just blood on her hands, and she does everything she can to try and wash it off, and to the point that she is panicking for it to come out, and nothing she does can remove her of her guilt. Nothing can cleanse her. So if our biggest problem resides in the heart, the question is, what should we do about it? And that's really the essence of Mark 7, verses 1 through 23. So if you have a Bible, we've been journeying through the book of Mark, and Mark 7 is just simply the next text in our study. And at first glance, it seems like, hey, here's Jesus having this argument with the Pharisees and the scribes, and it really has nothing to do with us. It's really not relevant. It's not applicable. But I want you to understand that this actually has everything to do with us. Listen to what the gospel writer Mark records in chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?' And he said to them, Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written? This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God. Then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do. And he called people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Well, as we progress through the Gospel of Mark, we've seen that the religious leaders have clearly rejected the claims of Jesus. And they're just looking, they're just waiting to catch Jesus, to entrap Jesus. And they see that this is their opportunity. And they jump on it. They see Jesus' disciples, they're eating with unclean hands. It was a basic Jewish custom, a ceremonial cleanliness. But you have to notice this. It's not really a concern with hygiene. I mean, don't walk away thinking, pastor said you don't have to wash your hands before you eat a meal. The Pharisees, we're told here, is that they're concerned with the tradition of the elders. The disciples weren't actually breaking the written law of Moses. What they were breaking was the tradition of the elders. So you gotta step back and just think about the Pharisees. Here they see themselves as guardians of the law, the written law of Moses, that they protect it, that they preserve it, and they study it and interpret it. In fact, the Mishnah, it's a compilation of Jewish oral laws that was written at the end of the 2nd century. And listen to what it says. It says, tradition is a fence around the law. And so in other words, they had this concern that, hey, we want to preserve the law of God, and so they would read it, they would study it, but then they would also interpret it, they would reinterpret it, and then they would say, let's add this tradition around it, these other things to try and protect it and preserve it so that people will continue to observe it and keep it and see it as important. So maybe their motives really weren't all that bad, but the more they did that, the further they got away from the actual intent and the heart of God's commands. So let me just read this for you. I came across this week in a book I was reading, and I think it helps paint a picture of how things got out of hand. This fencing of the law probably began well enough, but as the years passed, it produced some famous absurdities. For example, in order to protect the Sabbath from being broken through inadvertent labor, the devout were given an amazing list of prohibition. They were given fences. For example, looking in the mirror on the Sabbath was forbidden because you might see a gray hair and then you're tempted to pull it out and that might be considered work. You also could not wear false teeth. If they fell out, you'd have to pick them up and you would be working. In regard to carrying a burden, you could not carry a handkerchief on the Sabbath, but you could wear a handkerchief. This meant if you were upstairs and you wanted to take the handkerchief downstairs, you'd have to tie it around your neck, walk downstairs, untie it, and then you could blow your nose downstairs. The rabbis, it gets better. The rabbis debated about a man with a wooden leg. If his home caught on fire, could he carry the wooden leg out of the house on the Sabbath? One could spit on the Sabbath, but you had to be careful where. If it landed on the dirt and you scuffed it with your sandal, you might just be cultivating the soil. Again, doing work. So you get a picture there, right, of how in an effort to preserve the law and guard the law, they continue to add these traditions around the law and then they begin to lose sight of what the law was even there for in the first place. And so when we come to this story in Mark 7, same thing has to do with washing. It spiraled into legalism. To them, eating with unclean hands basically signified that you just have this indifference to the holiness of God and the morality. And so, they washed everything, the cups, the spoons, the kettles, every utensil meticulously. In fact, again, the Mishnah, that oral law of oral tradition there, had 35 pages dedicated to how you washed things. And so, they took things too far. And their problem, however, is more than just being a little extreme. It wasn't just that they had the strict adherence to the law and to their tradition. Their hearts were actually closed to God's grace. So, if we're to have a clean heart, if we're to find cleansing, we actually have to begin with the right standard. We have to measure our lives by the right standard. And so when you read the Old Testament, especially the book of Leviticus, and, it's still kind of early in the year, so many of you have started, I'm going to read through the Bible in a year, and you do great through Genesis and even Exodus, but then you get to Leviticus, and you're like, oh, there's a lot of laws about what's clean and what's unclean, and some of them are extremely confusing, and you say, okay, here's another law about what's clean, what's unclean, what in the world does this have to do with me? But listen, if you just step back and you consider them not in terms so much of hygiene, but spiritual matters, then their significance begins to rise to the surface, because what we see is that God is completely and totally holy without any defilement whatsoever. That they awaken us to the sense that we live under the eyes of a God who has no sin whatsoever, and that no matter what we do, we always seem to be unclean. The clean and unclean, those terms occur over 70 times in the book of Leviticus alone. And even though we can't understand them all, you get this clear sense that you can't approach God without being made clean. And so every time I read those sections of the Old Testament, I don't know about you, but I walk away thinking, there's no way that I could ever do things in just the right way to keep myself completely and totally pure, morally pure, without spot, without blemish, because the laws point to something deeper. It points to our hearts. And they're meant to humble us. Just like Isaiah, when he has that grand vision of God in Isaiah 6, and he says, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." He says that as he sees the Lord. He goes on later to say in Isaiah 64, all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. Saying even your best deeds, even the things that you think are righteous and worthy of praise, are in the sight of God never quite good enough. And so it becomes really clear to us that our sin, that our uncleanness, it destroys our souls. Yet the religious leaders here, they didn't really see it that way. They were more concerned with the outward behavior than they were the condition of their hearts. And look, I think we do this all the time. It is so easy for us to watch the behavior and the words of other people to the extent that we leave little room to be convicted of our own sin. Right? And so instead of measuring ourselves to the standard of God and his holiness, we tend to measure ourselves to the standard of other people, and we can always find someone that we think we're doing just a little bit better than they are. And so I want you to ask yourself this question as we're thinking about this text. Am I more angry with the sin, the weaknesses, and the failures of the people around me? Or am I more broken by my own sin? Because it's a very dangerous thing to be more concerned with the morality or lack of morality of other people than it is to be concerned about your own soul. Because what happens is the moment I do that, the moment I take my focus away from, hey, how do I measure up to God and how do I measure up to other people, I begin to close myself off from the grace of God. Because you cannot receive what you don't realize you actually need. Now look at Jesus' response really closely in verses 6 and 8. He said to them, and he's quoting Isaiah here, Isaiah 29:13, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and you hold to the tradition of men. And Jesus is, now he's not saying that all tradition is bad. But he is pointing to the fact that their tradition has really supplanted the word of God. It's obscured the very things that God has said. And he calls them hypocrites. He's saying, look, you say one thing with your mouth, but your heart speaks something else. They were pretending to be something that they weren't. He also says that their hearts are distant from God. They claim to know him, but they were living without compassion for other people. Concern for other people, without a heart that cares about the things that God cares about. Their hearts in many ways were just set on themselves. And third, he says that they've placed their tradition above the word of God, above the scriptures. And so we see that there's a tendency to measure ourselves by the standard of external behavior. We measure ourselves by what other people are doing around us, but our problem is always an internal problem. Our issue is always an internal issue. External behavior does not solve the problem. If your problem was just a matter of behavior and the things that you do on the outside, then the law could actually provide a means of rescue for you. And yet, if the problem is the heart, then there really is nothing that you can do to rescue yourself. In fact, I would argue that Jesus came to rescue you from you, from the wickedness that resides in the heart of all human beings. There's nothing we can do to cleanse ourselves. That really brings us to the next point. We have to begin by measuring ourselves to the right standard, but then we have to recognize that really there's nothing that you can do to cleanse yourself. I came across an interesting fact. One of the largest freshwater outlets, one of the biggest rivers, the Ganges River, provides water to about 1.4 billion people in India, all of Nepal, part of Bangladesh, and yet at the same time, it's actually one of the world's most polluted rivers. from all the towns and the factories. There's all these pollutants that are coming into it every single day. There's millions of gallons of raw sewage that are coming into it. And yet, despite all the studies by environmentalists and science, there's been almost no progress in cleaning up the river. And the reason why is because those who hold to Hinduism have this odd belief that the river can clean itself. That this river is actually some sort of goddess and can clean itself, and that people can actually get into the river and find cleansing on their own, and yet the river gets no cleaner as the years go by. I mean, they deceive themselves in thinking that this is the case. And in the same way, many of us live as if we can clean ourselves. And if we think that's the case, we'll never really look outside of ourselves and see what the real remedy is. And so in Jesus' response to the Pharisees, he shows them that the problem of their defilement is not an outside issue, but it's an inside issue. It's not an issue that can be dealt with by self-improvement and changes in your behavior, but it's an inward condition that really requires the intervention of God's grace in their lives. Look at what he says in 14 and 15. He calls all the people to him and he says, "Hear me, all of you understand there's nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And so he uses this very simple point. He says, look, your sinfulness arises from within yourself. And yet that runs so contrary to the modern narrative, the modern belief that everybody is just sort of naturally good, and whatever evil they do is really it's a response to your circumstances. But Jesus is saying that we sin because we're sinners. Amen. He's not saying you sin because, well, you were just, these are the circumstances you have, this is your environment, and really you're just a victim of the circumstances that you were put in. No, he says that your sinfulness comes from a sinful heart. It's not something that comes from outside of you. And here the Pharisees, they had this superficial view of sin that they thought, hey, I can fix this with just this mechanical outward obedience to the law and the regulations, and somehow through that I can please the living God. And we think, well, yeah, of course the Pharisees didn't get it. But what's even more shocking is the disciples didn't get it either, because Jesus gathers them in verses 18 and 19. They're asking him about this parable. It didn't quite make sense. And Jesus says to them, "Are you also without understanding?" He's saying, look, you guys didn't get it either, right? And so he really repeats himself. He says, look, do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him? He says, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled. Jesus has a very blunt way of putting it, of illustrating it. He says, if you eat a piece of unclean food, it goes into your mouth, down to your stomach, and eventually, out. I think he would have, you call it a latrine, wherever, it goes out. And so Jesus is saying that it never gets to the heart. And so the problem then can't be remedied by simply washing hands and doing these external things, because it never gets to the heart of the issue. The problem is in the center of who we really are. That is what is wrong. Well, then look, verse 21 and 23. He gives us a list. He says, from within, out of the heart of man comes evil thoughts, sexual morality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, evil, slander, pride, foolishness. All of these things, he says, comes from within. Now, I know you're all wanting me to go through each and every single one of those. We don't have time for that. But I want you to notice in there's both actions and motives. See, we have a tendency to think of sin as just something that we do, just merely actions. And while it's true, we have to realize that those actions don't just come out of nowhere. They don't just arise outside of ourselves, but they begin inside of ourselves. And so it means that a person's problem, if it's sexual immorality, it's not first and foremost physical sexual immorality, but it comes from a lustful heart that really craves and desires pleasures before it desires the honor of God. It means that a person's problem is not just physical theft. He mentioned stealing, but really that arises from a covetous heart that wants what doesn't belong, that hasn't been given by God. So behind every behavior is actually a belief. Behind every external action is a heart that is not right. The heart of a person, if you understand it in the biblical sense, when the Bible talks about the heart, it's not saying, this organ that pumps blood in your body. No, the heart is the center of who you are. It's the seat of your will and your emotion. It is who you are. And so when the heart is not cleansed, it becomes a factory of all sorts of evil. That's why the prophet Jeremiah said, the heart is wicked and deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? And so this brings again this question of what could I ever do then to cleanse our hearts? What could possibly make us acceptable in the presence of God? Well, there's nothing you can do other than to look to Christ. Now, that may seem simple, but I want you to go back to verse 19. And Mark has made an interesting parenthetical comment. You'll notice at the end of 19, in parentheses, he gives us this little commentary. He says, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Again, you might think, well, it's not something that has anything to do with me. But consider what Mark is saying here. He's telling us that Jesus is the fulfillment of all these confusing laws about clean and unclean. In other words, he's trying to tell us, look, Jesus has done something that you and I could never, ever do. In fact, hundreds of years before this, God actually revealed to his people exactly how he would deal with this problem of cleansing and a heart that is wicked and evil. Listen to what he says in Ezekiel 36. He says, "I'll sprinkle clean water on you, and you'll be clean. I'll cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I'll give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I'll remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh, and I'll put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. I will save you from all your uncleanness." And so what was God saying? He was saying, look, there's going to come a day when all these things about clean food and unclean food and how you wash and not wash, and he goes, you're not going to have to worry about that anymore, because I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to cleanse you from all your defilement. Now, this is all over the scriptures, but there is a picture, a striking picture in Zechariah 3. So Zechariah sees the scene in heaven in which Joshua, the high priest at that time, appears before God. And you have to keep in mind that the priest had to do all sorts of preparatory work before coming into the presence of the Lord to cleanse himself. He would only come in before God once a year, Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And in order to do that, there was all sorts of washings and preparation, at least a week beforehand, in order to prepare to come into the presence of God. And Zechariah sees Joshua appear before God, but do you know who else is there in that scene? It's actually Satan. And Satan is there to accuse him. And listen to what it says, Zechariah 3:3. Now Joshua was dressed in filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. Now the English translation doesn't really get at the full understanding of that, because in the original language it gives the idea that he was wearing garments that were actually covered in excrement. So can you imagine that? There's all these laws about the week beforehand, preparing, wearing the right garments, being clean, going through all the ceremonial washings. And here, the high priest appears before God, but yet his garment is covered in excrement. And it has to be a picture of how we look before God when we try to come to him in our own righteousness. And Satan is there accusing him. And by all standards, the Lord should bring condemnation upon him, strike him dead for being dressed in that way, for coming in such an unclean state. But before Satan can even speak, the angel says, take off his filthy clothes. And then the angel says, see, I have taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you. And God strips away his uncleanness. He provides clothes that he couldn't provide for himself. He even reclothed him in God's presence with a turban, which would have signified royalty at that time. He comes before God covered in his filth and defilement into his presence. But what God does is God removes all of that, and in its place he puts garments that are pure and holy, and a sign of God's acceptance. This is an amazing picture of what God can do for each and every person who comes to him. And he's showing us that there's a cleansing that only God can provide, where he takes away our defilement and our filth. And Satan, the accuser, has nothing to say against us, because God provides the very thing that he requires. And as you go on in the Gospel of Mark, you then will read that Jesus became unclean. He was treated as unclean and crucified outside the camp, so that we could draw near with full assurance, to draw near to him with cleansed hearts. So what should we do today? You know, the tragedy of the Pharisees is that they were unable to see themselves as they really are. I don't think they took seriously the words of Psalm 139, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there is any grievous way within me. You see, one of the best things that you can do today is to ask the Lord to search your heart, to say, God, okay, but before you, reveal to me the condition of my soul, the condition of my heart, where I stand before you, and so that I may know and that I may believe. We'll never have an obeying heart until we first have a believing heart. Let me just end with this. There's a book written by a guy named Von Roberts. He's a British pastor, and he was telling the story from the 1966 World Cup, in which the English soccer captain, he got the cup from Queen Elizabeth II. And of course, he had just finished playing a game. His hands are dirty. He was asked by an interviewer what it felt like, to walk up to the Queen of England and to receive the trophy. And he talked about how actually walking towards her majesty, that he was afraid. I mean, he was terrified. And here's why. He looked at the Queen, and she was wearing these white gloves, very pristine. And here are his hands covered in dirt. And he's getting ready to shake her hands. And as he's walking over, he's just trying, rubbing him on his shorts, trying to get all the dirt off, and listen to what the author said, he said, Bobby Moore was the soccer captain. He said, if Bobby Moore was worried about approaching the Queen with muddy hands, how much more horrified should we be at the prospect of approaching God? Because of our sin, we're not just dirty on the outside, our hearts are unclean. And God doesn't just wear white gloves. He is absolutely pure through and through. Amen. If you have any trepidation today of approaching God, I want you to know that He invites you. He invites you to come to Him. He will not turn you away, no matter how deep the stains, no matter how sinful you recognize yourself to be, no matter how clean you are. He invites you to come. He invites you to find cleansing. He invites you to come to Him and to be given a garment of white, so that you may enter into His presence.